Welcome to the Tea Shop, and today I'm so excited to chat with Deborah Nixon. I found Deborah through me listening to another podcast, and she was talking about partition stories. This whole podcast is dedicated to partition stories, and Deborah was one of the people. That's a great podcast if anybody wants to check out. They talk to people of all backgrounds, and I think it was nice of them to have an Anglo-Indian representing and talking and sharing the stories from that perspective. And Deborah has really interesting stories from that time period that we all don't think about and we don't factor in because we live in a bubble as Anglo-Indians, but we don't think about the partition story and how it affected the lives of Anglo-Indians and everybody in that area, right? So, Deborah, thank you so much for trying to get this set up was crazy because Australia is just known as a crazy land full of crazy people, but it also has a crazy time zone. So, thank you, Deborah. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about you, your personal life. Then I would definitely love to talk about your credentials and your professional life and your research and all that stuff.
Sure. So to start with, I wouldn't classify myself as Anglo-Indian.
Yeah.
Because my family didn't fit the correct definition, even though they were generationally in India and originally were classified as Anglo-Indian. So in my grandfather's generation, they were considered to be domiciled Europeans, which were more or less on the same social level as Anglo-Indians, and also worked predominantly in the railways. And they were not the British viewed Anglo-Indians with a little bit of suspicion because they didn't have the right accent, didn't send their kids to school in India and all the rest of it. So it's a really fine sort of definition, but my family history is a little bit murky, as a lot of people with generational ties to India might find. I am an academic at a university. I did my PhD thesis on railway technology, photography and cartography as sort of technologies of control in the last part of the colonial enterprise in India. My family was very much a part of that, being in the railways, but also they were all keen photographers. So I have an incredible sort of visual record of people in the railways, everybody.
Wow.
You know, Anglo-Indians, servants, photo bombing, all sorts of things. The photo bombers are one of the most interesting parts. You see somebody lurking in the shadows at the back or blurred across in the background. And of course, taking our single photograph was a bit of an event because it was expensive and clunky and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, so that's kind of what I did. And also my father and his 7 brothers and my father and his 7 brothers went to school in the north of India, in Mussoorie, a kind of hill town, the Shivalik Hills, which was where all the Anglo-Indian railway kids and so on went to school. So he went there from, I don't know, very, very young age, 9 months of the year, 3 months holiday, going home again. And apparently it was pretty horrific despite all the nostalgic sort of, the hill schools, blah, blah, blah. But it was terrifying for an early kid. Anyway, and then in the this long-winded biography, it does actually lead somewhere because...
I love the long stories, please. No shortcuts, yeah.
My father was about, I think, 21 at the time of partition. And he joined a Gurkha regiment in the British Indian Army and ended up being an escort on the trains that were running between Dharamshala and Pathankot, where the refugees were being put onto a different train and taken across the border into Pakistan. And that was a very excoriating experience for him as a young man. He did it for a full year, really.
A full year, wow.
Well, I think they started in when partition was declared August, and so it wasn't a full year, but it was for the duration of the partition. And I think the very last train was in late December or early January 1948.
So tell me about that. That seems, if you think about it, there's not many events in history where there was an organized transport of people from one country to another intent for some political reason, right? For that reason, right? For that long period of a time.
Yeah.
So that's. Can you think of any other time in history or any other event that kind of very rare, right?
I'm in this way, yes,
Yeah,
because at the time India was, the new India and Pakistan,
yeah,
and not to forget what was called East Pakistan, now
yeah,
Bangladesh,
yes,
um, was there was a kind of bit of a vacuum in the government, if you like. Although So my father and the Gurkhas, they did what they could, but the British army left, and the people that were left behind in the army, like my father and so on, were very young because all the
yeah,
other older officers who had reached the end of their commission just said, "I'm out of here." This
yeah,
is, and I don't know. It's interesting that you should raise that because, of course, partitions always have the most awful long
yeah,
term effects on the people that have been displaced, as we can see currently in the Middle East.
yeah,
And in India, it similarly, was a kind of. I reluctantly use the word genocide. I've
yeah,
seen other academics refer to it as retributive genocide because there wasn't a sort of
yeah,
government controlling what was going on to some degree.
yeah,
It was fairly absent. And it was between communities that had once lived quite amicably,
yeah,
but people had a lot to lose. So, especially in the Punjab where my father was,
yeah,
and unfortunately, that was probably where most of the mass killings occurred
yeah,
for those young guys. On the trains, it was pretty, pretty bad. I don't
yeah,
think he knew what he was getting into. Nobody did. Because the
yeah,
Gurkhas had also this sort of reputation for being fearless and in control
yes,
and powerful and all the rest of it. And that just all fell apart when you had thousands of people squashed onto one train
yeah,
and trains were slow, they were on fixed timetables and you couldn't ignore them coming. So if you
yeah,
were wanting to launch an attack,
yeah,
it would be pretty easy to do.
yeah,
So, and it was in the middle of the summer. Dad said it
oof,
was really, really hot.
yeah,
Old trains had these big windows that slid up, and people were opening them inside the trains. And he said they went in again and again and said, "You've got to close the windows
yeah.
because people were driving pikes into them." And
Oh my God.
it
Yeah.
was, but it was
Brutal.
unbearably hot. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was.
Yeah. Help us. First of all, I am so thankful. Like I am so hungry for this because and I don't know where to read, right? And I have so many questions, but I want to be methodical. I want to form a good mental picture, right? Help me understand the partition, right? Was it organized, and who organized? Who decided, like, hey, you need, because it seems like it was organized at some level, right? And who came to that agreement? Who organized, or was it people just fleeing out of fear?
Well, politically, the British decided to leave India because it
Yeah,
was probably costing them more money to stay than to go, and
yeah,
they wanted to get out. So under Mountbatten, there was a plan for the petition that was going to take a year, but it was brought forward to August
yeah,
1947. I never know whether it's forward or back, but anyway, it was a lot more precipitous than it was always going to be bad because there were going to be so many losers in this mix, and I would say everyone lost out in the end because of the number of casualties
yeah,
and just the trauma that it caused. So it was the British government, it was Mountbatten. There were also invested parties representing the Muslim community, the Sikh community, and the Hindu community because
yeah,
they were also it was I mean it was kind of drawn along religious lines in a sense to create a homeland for Muslims in a sense. It's just that in the Punjab, for example, the line went straight through a very rich farming area the Sikhs had lived in for ages. So, you know, there was a lot of panic. And it's hard for us to understand how slow communications were
Yeah.
in 1947 in
Yeah.
India, but
Yeah.
with confusion. People didn't know what was going
Yeah.
on. The police were in the area where my father was in Dharamsala. In fact, that picture is the Gurkha headquarters in Dharamsala
Oh,
from
wow.
1947. He was a
Was that
great.
taken by one of your families or
My
family
dad.
members?
He
Oh,
took a.
wow.
Yeah. He. I can send you a snap of a picture of it.
I would want a lot if you would. I'll take as much as you can share links with. I definitely. And before do you have? We'll get back to your story. Do you have a place where people? Do you have all this uploaded somewhere to share this rich history and documentation?
Not really. It's sort of just spread over podcasts and
Got it.
my thesis and
Yeah.
various articles I've written. So
Okay.
I don't really have a place where it's all kept, which I actually should do. But in fact, you
Yeah.
can't see it, but there's actually a cookery sitting over there too, which is, if you want me to fetch it, I can demonstrate.
But yes, let's do it if you're up for it. Yes.
Way, but um, and it's got tape on it because it's falling. The scabbard's falling apart. But
Oh,
you can
wow.
see the Gurkha.
My God.
So he
Is
was in.
that
I
how
can't
old is that?
pull it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a mystique that if you pull it out, you have to draw blood. And in fact,
Oh,
I was
really?
somebody to fix the scabbard, and he drew it out and nearly cut his thumb off. So I
Mm.
don't. But this was given to me by my father for one of my birthdays. Believe it or not, we had unusual birthday presents. Yeah.
That is that is such a intriguing gift in the sense it comes with warnings, right? People should get more gifts like that because
Yeah.
it's not cheap. It's not. It's a unique. It has so much of value and history, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
caveat emptor, don't pull it out
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Exactly.
something bad will happen.
Yes.
I've got
So
about 3 of them in here. So,
you have a little museum in your house that you could charge people to just walk around and look at the pictures.
well, that's what people say. In fact, I had a heritage object taken away to be restored, and the man that came in was just photographing everything, going, "What about your collection?" I go, "It's just a lot of stuff that my family collected,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
anyway,
Wow. Yeah.
bye bye.
So the British left, and then it seems to me that the partition wasn't just like a national division, right? It was pockets of religion and beliefs and land, and because it was so tumultuous, and all of a sudden there was no boss, people just regionally were starting to fight and claim and just who's going to be the top dog and take ownership. Was it opportunistic at the same time, right? For land, religion, for a lot of things, right?
Oh, and I think it wasn't it. There was also kindness shown to people,
Yeah.
which gets subsumed in the greater story of the violence because
Yeah. I-
we don't have final numbers on the number of people who died, but you know the figures vary, but it could be up to over 1.5 million people died in this mass exchange and everything. So I have the clearest account of it from my father because he was right there,
Yeah.
and I have spoken to other ex-Gurkha officers because, like I said, one of the parts of the British Indian Army that stayed to oversee the transfer of population were the Gurkhas, so I focused on them,
Yeah.
and they all pretty much concurred on the levels of violence that happened.
Yeah.
And in Dad's area, for example, because he was up there in Dharamsala, he was observing the Kangra Valley at midnight when partition was declared, and he said the whole valley just went up in flames
Oof.
almost immediately because everybody knew that that's when the transfer was about to happen,
Yeah.
and it just went bang. And he said after that it was just
Yeah.
full on. In Dharamsala, the majority of people in the police force were Muslim. So they had to get them out as quickly as possible. Um, and so there was no police force left to sort of do any sort of civil control. And so my dad's, if you want me to go back to that story
Yes,
of,
please.
you know, so their job was to take refugees. I don't know if you've been to Dharamsala in North
I
India.
I have not. I'm just pulling it up on a map. I'm trying to see where it is, but I see it. Okay, it's close to kind of like Jammu and Lahore. It's in Chandigarh up north there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so they had to get they had to pretty, and this is a terrible expression, but they had to drain the Muslims out of those areas and try and centralize it, and then get them to a place called Nagrota. I don't know. I think it's still on the map. There's a there's a kind of lake thing there now. So they had to get them from Dharamshala to Nagrota, and then at Nagrota they had to wait for a small gauge train to come in and pick the refugees up, and then they would take them along to Pathankot. Um, but on the way to Dharamsala, to between Dharamsala and Nagrota, there was an old Italian POW camp, and I
Did you say
think
Italian? What?
there was an Italian
Oh,
POW camp
oh,
that was,
really?
yeah, and I think there were Canadian missionary nuns there. Yes, it's all very weird, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But that's true. And so I said, well, how did you get them out of those hilly regions? And he said, well, people would walk, they'd put them onto buses, trucks, and then eventually try and get them down to the trains. I mean, this is a 21-year-old
Yeah,
doing this.
yeah,
And he was the commanding officer, if you like.
yeah,
And they were not unchallenged even in that area. So it was a huge responsibility.
yeah.
And my father wasn't a big, imposing, pompous figure either. He had what is disparagingly referred to as a Chichi accent, which was a sort of Anglo-Indian domiciled European accent. It's sometimes referred to as Bombay Welsh.
Oh, really? I never heard that. It's
It's a
funny now for
wonderful
us.
accent.
Yeah,
No one could ever pick where he was from, and he was reluctant to say he was from India. Australia. I don't know why, because I was going, tell them, and because people would say, "What's your accent?" and he'd say, "Oh, it's Bombay Welsh." I said, "It's an Anglo-Indian," but there was shame attached to not speaking like a pompous,
yeah.
having a very refined English accent. So
Wow.
you know. Anyway, so I also have some of his movement orders that he kept because he was. I mean, I think I've inherited this sort of collector vibe from him, but he actually kept some of his orders. And there's one written in pencil I've used in my thesis, which I can share with you as well, saying, "Tell young Nick," that's my father, to exercise caution on the way. He may meet trouble. We won't meet up tonight. We won't meet up tonight. That was my father
It
getting this
sounds.
paper message saying,
Wow.
"Don't move them tonight because
Yeah.
if you do, there'll be trouble, and we're not gonna meet tonight," sort of thing.
Wow. That does sound the way. Maybe it wasn't, but the way like the paper and the pencil, maybe of the old school way, it just sounds so extra dangerous and clandestine. Which it probably was. We just don't understand the weight of that as a 21-year-old, right? Man, and before I forget, what's your dad's full name?
Leslie Gerald Breen Nixon.
Oh, wow. wait, you have Leslie Gerald?
Breen
I've
Nixon.
never heard of the Breen as a name.
I think it's Irish name or something.
Mm.
But they had just to get, if you don't mind it jumping all over the place.
I'm like that. I'm so distracted. Yes, let's chase every shiny idea that pops up.
Well, when you mentioned the name, well,
Yes.
this is all part of the melange that was India in
Yes.
1947 and before. But in my father's family, there were 8 children, but then there was this additional boy who kept appearing in photographs. And I said to my father, "Who's that boy?" And he said, "Oh, that's Gordon Forbes." And I said, why is he in all the photographs? And he said, "Oh, his father was a local guy who was friends with my grandfather, and he had married a Scottish woman, which was unusual for, like a wealthy Indian to marry a Scottish woman was unusual. It was usually the other way around at that time.
Oh, really?
And a European man would marry an Indian woman, but wasn't hugely
Yeah.
usual. And he said, yeah, that his name was Hussein Amin. And he changed it to Gordon Forbes. I said, "What an ordinary name. Why did he do that?" He said, "Because his father didn't want him and his mother didn't want him because the parents split up. And so my grandfather said, we can take him one more. What difference is it going to make?" So
Yeah.
he ended up going to school with my father's family
Oh,
and
nice.
all the rest of it. But he took his mother's name because he was Anglo, but
Yeah.
not Anglo-Indian according to the definition.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a lot in names
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
But,
it
um,
is names, like, even I did not know the official definition of Anglo-Indian until I started this podcast, and I was talking to
Uta.
yes, exactly. Uther is a wealth of information. I feel so silly learning the basics. It feels like the education that we get in these podcasts should have been taught in schools. It's just basic Anglo-Indian. We study Indian history, but we don't study the nitty-gritty of the Anglo-Indian. The partition, like even that, I don't think. Maybe it's intentionally hush hush. Let's not talk about that in schools. I don't know.
Well, it was a huge rupture, and the generation that experienced partition are now pretty much all gone.
Yeah.
So I had a sense of urgency in my research. So I started going. I mean, I've been going to India, for lots of things, but in 2005, 2006, I made it my business to go to India to especially to interview people that were from my father's generation in the railway communities
Yes.
on the towns that my grandfather's railway ran through. So he was on the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Line, which was the first railway line in India. And the trains ran, so my grandfather was born in Maharashtra.
Okay.
And the trains ran through Maharashtra, right across to Jabalpur, Jhansi. It went right across central India, and then it was picked
Yeah.
up by another railway line. So, because when I asked my father where he came from, he just listed a whole lot of towns. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he
Yeah.
said, "Well, I was born in Agra, but we grew up in all these places."
Yeah.
I looked them up on a map, and it was just a railway line with all these.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so my
Yeah.
grandfather was a loco foreman, and Anglo-Indians worked in the
Yeah.
railways. That was railways and telegraph.
Yeah.
So, and it was a major part of, industrializing India and making it more India and connected, if you like, politically. So that's what I did. I went there and I went to all those.
By
Yeah, and
you know.
just recently there was a sort of docudrama on called Railway Men, and it was about the gas leak in Bhopal.
Yes.
And it was so funny because it was the railway men that actually came to the rescue of a lot of people. And it was
Yeah.
there, according to this docudrama.
Yeah.
But the trains, when they were calling in the trains to come and try and get people out, they were all along what would have been the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Line. So
Yeah.
I was recognizing the trains. I was going Indore, Jhansi,
Yeah.
Jabalpur.
Yeah.
It was incredible. Damo,
Yeah.
Itasi.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
the
the
railway lines were very integral.
yeah.
And the role Anglo-Indians played in the
Yep.
railways was,
Yep. I love. My dad was on the railways. He used to travel from on the East Coast up to Bhopal. Actually, he just left a day or two before that happened. And yes, so I just remember. But I just love. I'm just trying to form a mental picture, right, of the relationship between you and your dad. For him to sit down and tell you all these stories, it's something about his is just so cinematic and poetic. Just the relationship, just that of storytelling and passing on, although some of it not the best of happiest of times,
Mhm.
but still, there's something fascinating. I would love to know, like how would he sit down and tell you these things? Because and you seem to be someone who just absorbs information and a love for these stories, right? Just tell me about that experience. I would love to know that.
Well, I mean, my father actually said to me on one of my landmark birthdays, Deborah is a curious and inquiring person. I never stopped asking him questions. But he didn't automatically come out with stories about partition like
Yeah,
growing up. We knew that was in his background because he talked about the Gurkhas, he was very proud of it. But he didn't talk about the horrific things that happened because he was quite traumatized by a lot of these things. So, but once I said, Dad, I'm going to do a PhD and I'm going to make you the centerpiece of it, really, or you probably end up being the center of it because I'm going to hang, everything around, this history because it's really great to have a sort of
yes,
foundation like that. And then I would sit down and turn a mic on, and he liked that it was kind of formalized like that. And then he would start telling me some things I had never heard before that were just so excruciating that happened to him or that he witnessed it as such a young man, and a responsibility he felt in some of the situations that occurred. Um, I think you might have heard about one in the Partition podcast if you listen to that one
I
about the
don't
women in the
remember.
world. Yeah.
Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was, as you can imagine, it was extremely chaotic. Communications were slips of paper with pencil writing on them, and they'd been given some false information, my father said. He and his men had been told to go to a village because they were told that in the village, which was majority Hindu, that the village was going to be attacked. And so dad was in charge, so he set up the men, around the outskirts of the village. And then they approached the village. They hadn't, they had little machine guns, or it would have been pretty small
Sure.
machine gun. I think he said a machine gun, and they kukris and rifles and all the rest of it. They approached ready for some sort of conflict in order to protect the villagers, but the villagers saw Dad and his men and freaked out, and there were only women, children, and old people in the village, and they threw themselves into one of those really big jails, the big well.
Yeah, and the fields they have the giant ones. Yeah.
That's what they did. And
Oof.
Dad got there and he realized what had gone on. They had been given false information about what was going to happen, or incorrect information. It might have been true at the time when the message was sent. And he said there was just chaos. So he said they threw down their arms and went to the well, and they were taking dhotis and throwing them down the well and pulling people back up and all the rest of it. But he just said it was just chaos, and women were crying, and they were too tired to pull themselves up, and and he never got over that. Never. I mean, he would get extremely emotional when he was talking about that because he felt responsible, even though he was an instrument, I suppose, of it, but he wasn't actually responsible for it because they'd been operating on this completely different,
Yeah.
you know, data or information about what was going to happen. And when he was old and sick and, when he was in the last stage of his life, he got a fever and he started raving on about getting the women out of the well. And the
Wow.
nurse didn't know what he was talking about. And he sort of came to, but it lived with him like that.
Yeah.
He never ever forgot it.
Yeah.
And he would get very emotional. But it was like there were so many things happening all over the place that he only remembered these sort of I would call them sort of illuminated punctuation points, because I said to him, "What happened to you after that?" And I said, "Where did you go?" And he said, "I don't know. We just had to keep going, so we went somewhere else." And I think, the shock of what had happened just sort of obliterated whatever they did next, but they had to move on. So, he remembers these sort of points and then moved on. But that was pretty shocking for him, but he was open to telling me about it. And so, I mean, he had a great sense of humor as well. I mean, not that there was much that was funny about the partition, but he had a very good memory. He was an excellent shot. He was a rifleman. He liked talking about being with the Gurkhas and how amazing they were, and moving the refugees and getting onto the trains and all that kind of thing. But I think it would have been very strange for him to be see the trains being repurposed in that way during the partition,
Yeah.
because he came from a railway
Yeah.
family where railways were like, trains were like the new jets in the
Yeah.
sky. It
Yeah.
was revolutionary, it was safe, it was on time, it was modern, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden it was, I draw some kind of comparison in a not a direct way with the way trains were repurposed during the Holocaust in Germany as well. So from being at the peak of modernity and evidence, technological revolution, and all the rest of it, they just turned into the most horrendous vehicles of despair and death. And some partition researchers do draw quite a strong comparison, but it's with completely different purposes. But there
Sure.
were,
Yes.
that sort of
Yeah.
terrible reversal of their roles
Yeah.
at this time.
Yeah.
So, I'm sure that he felt that as well. And I
Yeah.
said to him, "Did you and your Gurkha escorts ride in the trains?" And he said, "No, we couldn't. If we went into the trains, we would have been killed. So we rode on the top, and he would be in the front, so that they could survive in order to save the people that were on the train."
Yeah.
But I talked to some guys that were closer to Lahore, and they just said there would be bodies all over the train stations, because trains would be coming in from India and then leaving New Pakistan and at the same time almost, and it would just be a bloodbath. And there were bodies in fields, and it was just terrible. The
Yeah.
panic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a time, golly. And I have never seen like even pictures, right? And and the only thing that came close to for really me feeling the weight of that horrible period of time in the history was when I went to Andaman and Nicobar Islands last year, and I saw the prison there. It
Mm.
kind of mild, right, compared to the other horrors, but I took the tour, and it was the heat and how they just whipped people. They still have the whipping post in the heat. Just a small, even that alone, right? It just brought me to tears. Like, oh, man, I did not even honor these people who suffered by being curious enough to study it and giving them my attention,
Mm.
and it is so sad. I just and I hope people would take this upon themselves to study the history that's not taught in schools. Like I think they deserve it. These unnamed people in groups were just like in the millions were just murdered, right? And just learning about that just feels like we owe it to ourselves. Do you know your dad? So how did he transition from like how did that? How did he transition from a loco engineer into like putting a gun in his hands and saying, "Go do this"? What was that?
He wasn't. He was just out of army training, really.
Got
He
it.
hadn't really worked or anything. So
Okay.
he actually signed up because he wanted to go and serve in the European theatre of war, but they declared peace on his way there. So he came back to India,
Okay.
in 1945, and then he rejoined and trained with the Gurkhas. But Dad was really lucky because he could speak Urdu,
Oh,
and
nice.
he learnt Gurkhali, and he could speak Hindi as well.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, he was
And
he
Bombay Welsh, of course.
and of course he was fluent in Bombay work. But yeah, so there wasn't really much transition. I mean, he
Yeah.
probably just went from this highly regimented school
Yeah.
into the army, and he would have understood discipline and all the rest
Yeah.
of it, and then ended up back in India when this great event exploded over their
Yeah.
heads. And so I have like I said, he was a collector. He kept a little booklet that was like the first Gurkha rifle. He was with the first King's Own first Gurkha rifles, and he kept a little booklet that they were given sort of at the beginning of the year with funny stories and that kind of thing. But there was also a very serious note in it about the fact that the Gurkhas were going to stay for the duration of the transition. So you were in, you know, and um, they were called an aid to the civil power. So it was a different role to being an active combatant in something like the European theatre of war, for example. So there wasn't an enemy per se. So an aid to the civil power was meant that the army was kind of stepping in when the police and so on collapsed. So that's a very loose definition for it. An expert would pick me up on that, but how I that's how I understand it to happen. So so they it was funny because they were trained to be combatants, but now they were in a position where they were escorts,
Yeah.
and they couldn't fire in a combatant sense unless they were being fired upon or attacked and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah. Yeah. That they weren't at war. It was also weird.
Right.
Rules of engagement was so confusing at that moment as well, I would imagine, right?
That's right. And
Yeah.
also, some people have done a lot of research about um, the Indian Army or the British Indian Army that had been in Europe and had come back to India, and a lot of people were in Sikh brigades and all the rest of it, and they hadn't been properly demobbed, so some of them still had arms and so on. But
Wait, what is demobbed?
well, sort of taken out of the army, if you
God.
like,
Okay.
properly gone through a process
Okay.
and all the rest of it. But one researcher I was looking at, because the whole sort of disbandment of the army after the British left India is very confusing. Do not get involved in military history. It is so confusing. But he said he thinks that the Indian army maintained a level of control during partition that was quite remarkable, considering quite a large number of people in the Indian army came from the Punjab, because the British
Interesting.
had an obsession with sort of military traits that they
Yeah.
referred to as in the martial races, like the Scots,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the Sikhs,
Yeah.
the Gawals and the Gurkhas,
Yeah.
who they recruited from Nepal and saw as being more trustworthy during the partition because they were sort of outsiders, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes,
I
very
did
interesting.
not know that you did not have to be a Gurkha from Nepal, that or the tribe, to join that. Like your dad was part of that.
Yeah, because the British, there were two levels of command, once again, quite a racist kind of construct as well. So there were two levels of command in the Gurkhas, and the top level were people that were the so-called British officers, and then there was a lower level of officers that were Gurkha, and then there were the Gurkhas. The people from Nepal were at yeah. So there were all these different levels, of command, if you like, but they worked together, obviously. And Dad had to go through, the blooding of his sword and,
What is that? Blooding of his sword.
well, in Dashera, it's a Hindu ceremony, and I don't want to get this wrong, so I won't.
Sure.
This is very big picture stuff.
Sure.
But during Dashera, it happens in November, and it's very important to Hindus, particularly from Nepal. And they sacrifice animals, and they wet their knives in the blood. So, and I have a whole series of photographs. My father was going click, 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 everything, because his big sword was being blooded. So this was probably blooded at Dashera as well. So they killed buffaloes,
Yeah.
and in a ceremony, there was a special man who had the role of doing that. It was partly a religious role, I believe, and he's the one that blooded the sword for you. Um, and it went for 10 days.
Wow.
So it was a real tamasha.
I love it.
Just share it. And it
You
went
got
for
your
10
dad's sense of humor, I see.
Yeah, he was pretty funny. And he said on the last day, they just went crazy and drank so much local
Yeah.
alcohol, all of them. He said he could barely get down the mountain. He had to be carried down in a stretcher or something. He was so sick. So it was this sort of wild festival with a lot of very staged kind of steps in it. And can also send you some photographs of Dishera if you're interested from
Absolutely. Yeah.
1946 would have been the one that he was involved in. So what happened during Dishera as well was if the guy that was doing the blooding got it wrong, it would bring bad luck on the regiments. So one regiment, this did happen. I can't remember exactly the story, but it wasn't a good outcome for them. And on towards the end of the ceremony, then it was Dad's turn to go and get some goats and provide food to his Gurkhas, to his Nepali subordinates, if you like. And I was speaking to an ex-army officer in Chandigarh from the Gurkhas, and he was like offered the best sort of anthropological description of it in a sense. He said it was very prescient of the British to get involved in Dishera because it created this really strong bond between the
Interesting.
men. And they understood how important Dishera was to the
Yeah.
Nepali Gurkhas.
Yeah.
And it certainly did. My father had so much admiration for them. Yeah. So he had no desire to return to India.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah. Yeah. When did you before I get distracted by the next shiny thought, right? You said you recorded your father on a microphone. Do you still have all those audio? And is it published somewhere? Is it documented? Yeah, it is somewhere online.
It is. And I can try and find it because the Australian Broadcasting Commission asked a friend of mine called Neil Banerjee. He's Bangladeshi. So he has the story from some of the people in his community about that side of things. And then I was a known contact of his. So he asked me to provide the other side, the Western side, if you like. And we did a podcast together for the Australian Broadcasting Commission. And they asked me the same thing. Do you have any recordings of your father? And I said, I do, but they're on tiny, weeny little cassettes.
Yeah.
And they digitized them.
Oh, nice.
And they are in that podcast, which I'll try and find and I can send to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think it's on your. At least I saw some link to on abc.net
Children?
on the uts.edu site, I think. I'm not sure if
There's-
that's the one you're referencing, but I'll check it out. If you can find it as well, that'll be awesome.
So There's one, I think it's called Partition's Children, and that's the one that Neil and I did.
Okay.
And
Uh,
there's a picture on the podcast site of some Gurkhas sitting on top of a train with a rifle.
okay.
And that was a photograph that my father took.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely. Um, and this is something I was talking to Uther as well. Uh, like, I'm not sure if you know Bridget from Bridget White Kumar from Bangalore. She she's an excellent chef, and she just the history that is just she's collected, right, photographs. First of all, she told me she would wake up when she was a kid. She would wake up and open her front door and see like horse-drawn carriages. It's like, what? That's like not to date anybody, but it's not that long ago, right? In my mind, it's like what people alive today experience that. Yes, because it wasn't that long ago, but we don't get to see that, So I'm playing around with the idea of just some heritage, like Wikipedia, that that those stories, the recordings of your dad would make it's so rich that people can just listen to, that will is lost, forgotten, or even unheard of, right? If you don't speak to every single Anglo-Indian in this world, they will never know that story. So I think it's such important work that should be documented, and I'd love to figure out a solution to that. And I'll have to reach out to you if I ever figure out a solution.
I'd
Not
love the photographs to go somewhere, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um, we I don't know if you know, but in Amritsar they have a partition museum,
Oh, really?
and they just opened one in Delhi as well. The Partition Museum, ironically, is in the old British Town Hall in Amritsar, quite near a place called Jallianwala Bagh, where there was a terrible massacre in
Oof.
1919, instrumented by the British, but the soldiers that were used in the massacre were Nepali Gurkhas. So I went there with a slight cringy feeling, but actually got one of Dad's photographs into the Partition
Oh,
Museum in
really?
Amritsar. So he took a very beautiful photograph of Lahore railway station before the partition,
Yeah,
because it was all part of India
yeah,
then, and it wouldn't have been so far from Dharamsala, and they would have gone on the train.
yeah.
So he took some photographs of the canals in Lahore and the Botanic Gardens and the train station, and
Wow.
just people in the street. A
Yeah,
photograph of three girls in their salwar kameez with their long
yeah,
dark plaits, and another man, he said, here is a Khan holding two children. And it was a Khan,
yeah,
a Khan is a group.
yeah, yeah,
And it's quite extraordinary. He did some street photographs
yeah.
like that as well. There's another one he took somewhere of a guy at a cremation, with a body on the street. It was really in Mao military town. Yeah. So just I guess to bookend this in a sense, when the partition was over
Yeah.
for the military, like when the last train rumbled between India and the new Pakistan,
Roughly
in,
when was that?
it was, I think, I'm a little shaky on this. It's either very late December or early January 1948.
Okay.
But he was decommissioned after that. He went to a place called Deolali, which is quite famous because it was a camp for demobbing soldiers before they were then discharged from the army. And so he went there. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression doolally, to go doolally, means
No.
to go crazy.
Oh, really?
So it's a pun on Deolali, or camp fever.
Oh, wow.
Deolali is the name of a town north of. So the jumping off point for getting people out of India was in Mumbai on that side. So you went to Mumbai, and your last view of India was the gateway to India, and you went. So he was in Deolali himself, and very traumatized.
Yep.
No psychological kind
Yep.
of how you feeling,
Yep.
nothing. just this freaked out 22-year-old.
Yeah.
Still had his knives and all that. And he was in a little tent in Deolele, and he said it was literally a dark and stormy night. And he said a dacoit came into his tent to try and steal his stuff. And he pulled his knife out on reflex and waved it at the guy, and he ran off. And that was his last memory. Yeah, and then he went down and he got onto one of those gigantic big, no, not gigantic big, a gigantic ship called the Australis that was moving people all around. These big ships were moving people around the globe, if you like. So Anglo-Indians, everyone from India was getting onto these big ships, and he arrived in Perth in Western Australia because he met an Australian guy in India who said, when this is over, you know, we should go to Australia. You can go crocodile hunting. We can both shoot. This will be amazing. My dad's going, that sounds like a bloody fantastic idea. So he got there and the other guy didn't turn up. So he didn't know anybody, and he was a sort of stranger in a strange land. And Australia was very racist. So he arrived, you know, he had a funny accent. He was from India. He was a bit sort of dark, you know. And all the rest of it. And he ended up going to university and studying geology.
Oh, wow.
The best thing that ever happened to him was that he met my mother, who took him with all his problems and exoticness and knives and all the rest of it. And they had a very successful marriage.
So,
and he,
continue. Tell me.
No, that's it.
Okay. So, so you obviously grew up in Australia, but you're linked to the whole Anglo-Indian is through your dad and your grandfather. What was your grandfather Anglo-Indian, or was he a full?
I never met him.
Okay.
I never met him. When partition happened, like my family were in Maharashtra.
Yeah.
And there were, like, my father was probably, because there were 9 of them, so he was somewhere in the middle. But the 3 youngest went with their stepmother and my grandfather, because my grandmother died when she was about 39. She's buried in Busawa with my great-grandmother. So when Dad left India, he had no idea where anybody was. And my grandfather took the 3 youngest and his, I don't know, Danish new wife or something to the UK, and he didn't leave the ship. He just said, it's too cold. I can't do this. I'm not even getting off. So they stayed down south somewhere in England, and they got on another ship and went to Florida.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he died when he was quite young, I guess. He was about 65. Not a very healthy guy. He was a chain smoker and whiskey drinker and, you know, different lifestyle.
Yeah.
And the 2 aunties died quite young and didn't want to go to America, didn't want to leave India. And then, so Dad was one of the last one, I think probably the last one of his family to live, because my mother looked after him so well, and he made the best choice coming to Australia rather than America or the UK. And one of them ended up in Johannesburg.
Okay.
They completely lost touch with one another. So I don't really know much about my grandfather at all, except that his mother was born in India, and so was his grandfather, I believe. There is a connection, and it says on Ancestry there's an ancestral connection to some Anglo-Indians in Bengal, but I don't know who they are really. Yeah.
Man, that would, after such a traumatic life, and although it was your dad's generation, it would have been nice if you could somehow reconnect, because I'm sure that family has stories as well, common stories, and finding that we are actually related. The stories are so much more personal. That would be nice. So your dad, So your dad, you could just take a ship and travel, or obviously like choose the country of your choice. How is that?
Australia had the White Australia policy.
Where was that?
That was a sort of screening device for people who weren't of the right culture or color. But he could claim to be European because his mother was English. But other Anglo-Indians were, there was a difficult screening process. So Anglo-Indians who felt like they were more Anglo than Indian in a
Yeah.
sense, because of the way they've been brought up in this sort of interstitial communities, um, they it was sort of they identified as being culturally European. So the I mean, it was a very racist time in Australia. We had already tried to eliminate as many Indigenous people as we could. Not me, but that was the go. We had a very brutal early contact history, just as America did, I guess. Um, and quite a few Anglo-Indians did make it through, and so there's a very large population of Anglo-Indians in Perth, where Dad first arrived, but he didn't stay in Perth. He and my mother left. They went to Tasmania where he got work, and then eventually to Adelaide, which is in the middle of Australia. I said Dad chose Adelaide because it was the most boring place on. Sorry, people from Adelaide, but it really is. It was quite dull back in the early 50s. And I think he just went for something that was very dull because, he'd been
Yes.
through so much.
Yeah.
And then they just had a really full, fantastic life there. He eventually did, but oddly, a couple of people from his school were also in Adelaide.
Oh wow.
Anglo-Indians who went from his school. So I think the word got out. And there was a guy who was German Indian who was around the corner, taught my mother, his wife taught my mother how to cook food that my father demanded eating in a curry.
Yeah.
It was very hard to get in those days in Adelaide,
Back
getting
then,
the
yeah.
ingredients. So my mother used to get desiccated coconut and squeeze it through a Muslim handkerchief to try and create coconut milk. And
Yeah. Wow.
have to go to like the
Devotion.
sorry?
Devotion, I tell you.
Oh yeah, he had a lot of Gorka left in him. It was pretty hard. He was a scary guy to grow up with. He had 6 kids and he was really scary. He didn't. He was not a violent person. Quaked at the sight of blood. He never once smacked us, but he just had this sort of my mother's threat was always to get us to behave. Your father's just about to come home, and it would be like, no, anything but put up with his rage. He never once touched us.
Yeah.
He was a very funny guy. He was a really great guy. Yeah.
Yeah. He sounds like, I really, I like your whole life, so your dad definitely sounds like an enigma, and he definitely sounds like a strong leader who right and like as you experienced, right, he was definitely strong and hey, for no other way to put it, a man's man. But and he raised you well. And did you say you have 5 siblings as well?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
So I think it usually befalls one person in the next generation to archive
Yes.
the history in a sense, and it seems to have fallen on me
Yeah.
because I was very interested in doing this little
Yeah.
chapter of uh, my background before I became an applied linguist was to be, I studied anthropology and history and the history of India and everything. And also growing up with somebody who you so rightly, Conrad, picked up that he was enigmatic. He really was. He was
Yeah.
different to all the other fathers.
Yeah.
In fact, I went to my school reunion last year and someone said, "Oh, I remember your parents. Your father was so good looking, and he had that Canadian accent." It was an Anglo-Indian accent or an
Yeah.
Indian sort of accent.
Yeah.
Came from India? And I said, "Yes." Oh, that's why he was so good looking. And I said, "Well, I don't know." But
Yeah.
so he was, yeah, he was out of the box really. He was quite um, eccentric, enigmatic, but he was very ethical. And he was very strong on the way they behaved during the partition. I know that he wasn't hiding anything from me. He was very worried about me going to India when the first time I went there was
Yeah.
in the 1980s or something,
Yeah.
because I was always very drawn to going there. So I went on there.
Did you go by yourself?
No, I went with a boyfriend.
Did your dad ever go back to India?
Never.
Mm.
And every time I went there, he said, you want to be really careful on the trains, Deborah. They're not safe.
Wow.
I said,
Yeah.
Dad, it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
You know, oh, it's, and he'd
Yeah.
worry a lot about me going. And I say, look, Dad, it's okay. I can look after myself and so on. And I mean, he's been, I don't know how many times, maybe 10 times or something, and not always to the areas where he was.
Sure.
He didn't give me enough information to start
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
But then when I got busy on my research and I found out about the railway communities and where they were and the partition and all the rest of it,
Yeah.
that's when I thought, wow, this is a really great PhD thesis,
Yeah.
looking at the role of photographs in memory and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
then he wouldn't have liked it, but I did take some of his ashes to Varanasi with an
Oh,
Indian
really?
friend of mine, yeah.
Yeah.
Taking you back whether you like it or not, because you are India and India is you.
Are you the youngest of all siblings?
No, I'm sort of in the
In
middle.
the, like your dad, he was kind of in the middle as well,
Yeah, I'm
right?
third from the top and
Yeah.
third from the bottom. There
Yeah.
were six of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. If you have time, I would love to talk about your PhD and that process and what was the motivation.
Um, well, I'm an academic and I work in the field of applied linguistics, but I wasn't, and it's interesting, but I didn't want to spend 5 years working on it
Yeah.
in a data-driven sort of looking at student experience, which is very valuable, but not my jam.
Yeah.
And I kept going back to, the story in the family, and I started reading about Anglo-Indian research, and there was a woman at my university called Devlina Ghosh who was very supportive of me doing it, and she heard me talking one day. Oh no, there was a guest speaker from India, Anjali, and she'd written about partition, and she was doing a guest lecture. She was talking about partition and about how her parents came from what is now Pakistan into India, and it was tricky. Anyway, they live in Karnataka now. And
Okay.
afterwards, I went and spoke to her, and I said, "Wow, that's amazing. Maybe my dad was an escort on the trains
Yeah.
through,
Yeah.
And she said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, my father was a soldier escort on the trains in Punjab." And she went, "Wow." And then he'd already given me some of his documents. And I said, "I've got some documents. Would you like to see them while you're visiting the university?" And she said, "Yes." So I took them to her, and she just went, "Oh my God, you've actually
Yeah.
got a thesis here."
Yeah.
And Devlina was there as well. And she said, "Do it, Deborah, and I'll support you." And that started it. So yeah, that's really how it happened.
Wow. Uh, I am as you talk, Deborah. I'm just my mind is racing. There needs to be documentation, a collection of things online. I would, I don't know. Just the photographs. If and did he also mention cartography or just photography in the beginning?
No, I stitched in cartography, very light touch,
Okay.
because it had such a catastrophic influence on what
Yeah.
happened to the end of British rule in India,
Yeah. Okay.
along with everything else.
Okay.
But I was also the British obsession with, cartography, dividing and quitting, the census, labeling everybody, trying to get a centralized government happening. But it was when I was doing the actual thesis, it was really the focus shifted to the photographs, because I had photographs of the railways, of the railway trains, and the people that worked in the communities. And when I went to Jhansi, for example, there was a very famous Anglo-Indian contact person there called Peggy Cantum. She was already in her probably mid to late 80s when I met
Oh,
her,
wow.
but unbelievable. She looked after the cemetery. She had all these contacts. She said, "There's this other guy you've got to see called, oh my God, his name's just gone out of my head. I can see his face. I'll remember it later." But anyway, Roy Abbott
Okay.
of the Abbott family. And I don't know if you remember when there's a town in Pakistan now called Abbottabad, but very famous family. But he was very much 100% British, no doubt. And he was still living like he was in British India. I've got a photograph of his house. So Peggy said, "Okay, we're going to go over and see him. I'll get my driver to pick us up. You bring your photographs. We'll meet Roy." I used to help out with his wife because his wife was Anglo-Indian. But they didn't have any children, and his wife was very sick. And Peggy was like this linchpin in the community. She was just extraordinary. Anyway, so we went over there. And I have a photograph of them sitting in the garden looking at all these photographs that I had of the railways. And Peggy said, she was showing Roy this picture. And Roy said, "Oh my God, that is my uncle sitting next to your grandfather."
No way.
Way. And so I then got a copy made for him and he put it up in his hallway with his other family photographs. And that was gold because then he said, "Oh, you have to come out to my farm and you have to do this." And he was acting like a nabob. Like we went out there, he had servants running around. I felt quite embarrassed. But yeah, so we went out to his farm and he was growing lentils and eucalypts and crops, and all the farm hands came in to meet him. He owned a village that was on his property, and when we arrived, all the tractors were lined up with,
Oh, wow.
people on them. It was just extraordinary.
Roy Abbott, is that what you said? That's funny.
Roy Abbott.
Wait, but is is Abbottabad and Abbott in any way the name, or am I,
The Abbotts had really, really large swathes of property.
so is that why it's called Abbottabad? It like kind of morphed into that? Really?
Yes, apparently. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
They had land everywhere.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic book called Raj Days Down Under, written by an academic from New Zealand called Dorothy McMiniman.
I've spoken to her, yes.
Yeah, okay. So
Yes.
she's Anglo-Pakistani.
Yes.
Yeah. She's from Rawalpindi, I think. And she interviewed the Abbotts as well, but the one that was in New Zealand. So I
Okay.
said, I've got the story from Roy Abbott in India.
When do you have like that on? Was that a written interview? Do you have it like audio?
It was written because,
Okay.
like with older people, it was with the recording and everything. And back
Yeah.
then, I just had this I didn't have a proper digital recorder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it was, I would just make notes. And what I did was, I would then share the notes and second check with them that I got the voice right. So the last thing you want to do is get a story from someone and then bugger it up by, saying something that they would never want to be associated with or something like that. But people were so generous to me, and I must admit, I did shamelessly flog my connection with the railway community because it provided me with such a privileged
Yeah.
behind the scenes connection with the communities as well. It's like, oh my God, she's one of us. And the great, yeah, and it was just, people were so generous to me. There were people, Anglo-Indians in all those towns. There's a wonderful guy called Dunstan Gamble in Jabalpur, and he and his family, they took me everywhere, and Jhansi, just everywhere. And
Yeah.
the Gawal as well, that's where I found my grandmother and my great-grandmother's graves.
Yeah.
And there was a connection there from another a guy I met in Jhansi rang his brother and said, Deborah's on her way, you've got to look after her when she gets there. And so, I had dinner with them, and then they took me around, and there was an old sort of meeting hall that no one used anymore called the Limpus Club. And it was the Anglo-Indian and domiciled European social club. And they put me inside. It was all empty, dusty floors and stacked
Yeah.
furniture. And there was one of those old-fashioned wooden honor boards, and in gold letters, there was my grandfather's name as the
What?
president of the club in 1935 or something.
My God, that's so the unexpected discoveries are so fun, right? And so amazing, right? Just walking in and seeing those things.
It's honestly, I got goosebumps. And then
Yeah.
he said, okay, well, we better get over to the railway station. So he
Yeah.
took me behind the scenes in Busawal railway station, where once again there was sort of, back offices with sort of still with desks with inkwells in them and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Wow.
And there was an honor board in there saying my grandfather was the loco foreman in whatever it was.
Wow.
And it was like, I had all these people around me at this stage. I had goosebumps. And then we went to the church that my family used to go to, and we woke up the priest in the middle of the afternoon. Anyway, came in dressed in a t-shirt and a towel, sat down bleary-eyed. And I was going, I'm so sorry. And he goes, no, it's not a problem. And he had this kind of wooden cupboard behind him. And I said, my family were here and these dates, and my grandmothers and all that are buried in the cemetery. And he threw open this big cupboard and pulled down and sort of threw this big ledger onto the table, like something out of Harry Potter. We went through them, and they were the birth records and the death records.
No way. Wow.
Hey!
I'm impressed that those records were kept
Well, the British
intact.
were very
Yeah.
scrupulous, and there was some sort of, well, there were church records as well. So the church looked after them. They were Roman Catholics. The
Yeah.
priest was from South India because not many Christian priests still in the north of India.
Yep.
So there were
Yep.
more Christians in the south. So,
Yep.
but so that is just a morsel of the generosity I was shown, and honestly, Anglo Indians just have so much fun. They're so funny, and they were so gorgeous to me, and I
Do
really felt like
you?
part of it. Yeah.
Does your family? Do you have children, or do you? Do you? But do you? Does your family at large still maintain some relationship like you, like going back to India, or is it on the minds, or is it intentional, or?
Yeah. Look, I did,
Yeah.
and then I kept telling everyone, "You got to go. You got to go. This is our story.
Yeah.
It's so deep, and it's not just something that we could sort of prize out of Dad under duress. It really happened. Like when I saw my grandmother's grave, I kind of put my hand on it just to, like,
Yeah.
it's real, and a tiny piece of marble came off, and I was showing my brother in Adelaide, and he goes, "Oh my God, it's like holding a piece of the moon."
Yeah. Yeah.
That history was so remote, but it's so real at the same
Yeah.
time. And so my youngest brother went with his wife, and they went to Mussoorie. They went to all the places. I told them, you got to go to Amritsar,
Yeah.
see the photograph in the museum. You got to go. They didn't go to those railway towns. I said, look, I don't think they're not really for tourists, and they're more like tourists than I am. So for
Okay.
me, they're just endlessly interesting, but they're not really touristic. Jhansi's great though, because you got the Rani of Jhansi. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
other interesting thing about Jhansi was, so the other part of the railway community, right? The Anglo-Indians, domiciled Europeans, and Parsis. So I met some members of the Parsi community in Jhansi. So Farrokh Pastonji was a really close friend of Peggy Cantum's. And I said to Peggy, are there any Parsis still here? Oh, yes, you've got to meet Farrokh Pastonji. So his family, actually, a lot of his family were in Perth, and I'd seen a website
Oh wow.
about the Parsis of Jhansi, and I really wanted to meet them. And he took me around to the railway yards, back of room stuff again in Jhansi, and he said, this is probably the office that your grandfather worked in, this tiny little office. Then he took me to the loco train yards, And then he took me to meet his uncle, who was one of the last loco drivers, because, before the railway lines were electrified. Like, he wasn't the same generation as my father, he was younger. And so I met this wonderful old guy. He was blind, he was living on his own, but his nephew and everything looked after him. So, yeah, that was the level of connection. But for me, it was easy to go to those places
Yeah.
because I knew all the connections. So my younger brother, getting back to your original story, question, he went mostly to Missouri and places like
Yeah.
that. And then my younger sister said, "We want to go too, but we want you to come with us."
Oh,
And I said,
nice.
"I don't know if I want to go." So I said, "Few rules. Don't drink too much alcohol. Don't drink the water,
Yeah.
obviously, and
Yeah.
don't eat too much meat." So they did everything wrong. And so I was the only person going down for breakfast in the morning because I'm veg anyway.
Oh,
And I don't
really?
drink alcohol anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anyway, they recovered. They were troopers. But we did go to the one thing we did was that was really interesting was I said to my sister, "I know that Agra's on your map. You want to go to Agra and see the Taj Mahal? That's where my father was born." And I said, "Well, I haven't seen is the church where he was baptized." So I got onto a local Anglo-Indian who put me onto the priest in Agra, and we found the church. So that
Oh,
was,
wow. Wow.
yeah.
It's so amazing. I think I love your stories because I'm the youngest in my family, and there's a lot of knickknacks for handed on. My grandmother was a kind of collector, and she passed it on to my mother. And my sister, if they listen to it, I've told them this. I feel like they don't care about the stuff. Whereas I go and I look at just a vase or a tea set that has been handed on from generation to generation to generation, right? I like keep it for me. Just save it. I want it at some when it's safe enough. I don't want to take it out of India because I don't want it to break, and I'll be so sad, you know. But I love going back and just looking at the history. I love that story, and I'm so thankful, Deborah, for taking us. I hope you don't mind this comparison. It's almost like watching the Titanic and you're like Rose, you're telling us the story of your life, right? You took us on this journey. I hope you don't mind. Not for anything else,
More
but
of an exotic background than Rose.
yes, yeah. but you took us on this journey. You invited us, and you're such a great storyteller. I love that just listening to you talk, and it is so fascinating. I wish I could, and I'm already thinking, how do I get people with the same interests as mine and create a documentary, right? Because I think that would be ideal. People to tell us the stories. You, Dorothy McMiniman, right? And that would be such a cool thing to do. I need to talk to people. I'm not sure what, but I think it has to be done. And the stuff that you have, the collections, if you can just uncover that and we can just go through that, that would be such a rich for people like me. My sisters, maybe not, I'm joking, but people like me would just love to see it, so thank you so much.
Where are your family from? It's been all about me, so.
Oh, yeah, I'm from I grew up actually I was born in Maharashtra as well, in Bombay, but I moved. My dad was also on the railways, so we moved from wherever he was stationed, but we ended up in Madras, in Chennai, the southeast. Yeah, so that's where I grew up. A lot of Anglo-Indian friends. I grew up in a small Anglo-Indian community. I joke with everybody on here, like saying that my Parambo is the Anglo-Indian capital of the world, because for one, I did not travel in India to see other places. So based on my extensive local knowledge, it's the capital of the world, yes. But I moved to Atlanta many years ago, yeah.
So you know Harry McClure?
I do know Harry. Actually, I do know Harry McClure. I might have actually met him because my dad knows him very well. My dad was like a the president of the Anglo-Indian Association.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, cool.
Yeah. I'm trying to get Harry McClure on here as well. I'm sure he has some awesome stories. How do you know him? Did you go to the South or?
No, he had a magazine called Anglos in the
Yeah,
Wind,
in the wind. Yes.
and I don't think they're publishing it anymore. But I went to an Anglo-Indian conference. I've been to a few, and I
Are
went
you
to.
going to the one next year?
I don't know. I
Okay.
might.
Okay.
I'm actually going to Istanbul in the middle of this year, so I don't know if I can afford both. But
Okay.
but but I think it was through that, or just when I was doing my research,
Yeah.
someone told me about Anglos in the Wind, and then I was in India. I went to Calcutta for a conference and all that sort of thing, and then I went to Chennai,
Nice.
and I met Harry at his offices
Yes.
and had a chat with him there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I met him.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. I'm so glad you went to Madras because that's my hometown. So I'm glad you visited the South.
Yeah, it
So
was a
there's
bit
some connection.
overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, Deborah, I definitely thank you so much again. I appreciate you. I appreciate the time. I appreciate your curiosity and your collection. I definitely want to get back in touch with you and see how we can document it if you're open to it. And share links and pictures in the meantime as much as we can for the curious. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I enjoyed it more than you can imagine even. So appreciate it.
I enjoyed it very much too, and I'm sorry I go off on a lot of tangents, but
No, I love it.
big
I
story.
love it. So it's called the tea shop, right? And in your travels, I'm sure you've seen like the thousands of tea shop on every street, right? So it's a tea shop. It was just two friends chatting conversationally. Nothing too. It's not an interview, so we can talk about anything and everything. The format is really open ended. So that, and I'm so distracted as well. I cannot have a straight conversation about one topic for too long.
Actually, you know what? Just calling this the tea shop. There was this fantastic tea shop near Masuri called Chai
Yeah.
Chacha Chugli.
Oh, what's that? What's that?
It means tea,
Yeah.
gossip, and discussion, something like that.
Oh, really? Nice. Yeah. Get him to sponsor us. No, I'm joking.
It's a real. I can send you the sign for it. I just think it's the best name.
Yes, please.
For a cafe.
Yes.
Chai Chacha Chugli.
Yes. Yeah, you have a picture of the sign? Please do.
I
Yes.
do. But you've got my email, so
Yes.
maybe and also my Facebook. So quite a lot of photographs are on the Facebook.
Nice. Okay.
But if you give me an email or something, then I can put my photographs in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think, as much as we can package up, because people who listen to this podcast, as much as we can package up and put links and stuff like that, while they're listening, they can go check it out. I'm hoping to put a map and track the railway routes and all the things that you told me as well. But yes, I definitely, thank you so much, Deborah.